You're listening to the Sex and Psychology Podcast, the sex ed you never got in school and won't get anywhere else. I am your host, Dr. Justin Lehmiller. I am a social psychologist and research fellow at the Kinsey Institute and author of the book, Tell Me What You Want, The Science of Sexual Desire and How It Can Help You Improve Your Sex Life. Consensual non-monogamy, or CNM for short, is one of those topics that people are increasingly talking about. But it seems like everyone has an opinion on it. And a lot of those opinions are decidedly negative. For example, I've heard people say things like open relationships never work. And how is that any different from cheating? The research bears this out too. People tend to rate persons in sexually open relationships in a far more negative light compared to monogamous folks. And this stems from the fact that there are lots of myths, stereotypes, and misconceptions that people hold about consensual non-monogamy. So in today's show, we're going to separate fact from fiction. For example, we'll talk about what makes CNM different from infidelity, the difference between how monogamous and consensually non-monogamous folks define cheating, whether people in open relationships necessarily have a higher risk of STIs, what makes CNM relationships work, and so much more. My guest is Dr. Justin Mogilski, an associate professor of psychology at the University of South Carolina, Salkehatchie, where he teaches courses on human sexuality, the psychology of marriage, and evolutionary psychology. Dr. Mogilski recently published a study of nearly 5,000 monogamous and consensually non-monogamous people that aims to better understand how people maintain multiple intimate relationships. This is going to be a fascinating conversation that will bust a lot of myths and set the record straight. Hi, Justin, and welcome to the show.
Hello. Well, thank you for having me. It's always good to talk to you.
It's a pleasure to have you here, and always fun to speak to a fellow Justin who's a sex researcher.
There are plenty of us.
So we're going to be talking all about consensual non-monogamy today and things that a lot of people get wrong about it. So let's start with the definitional question, because that's where I usually like to begin my conversations. And I think this is important here because a lot of people don't really even seem to understand what consensual non-monogamy or CNM really is. I mean, a lot of people hear the phrase consensual non-monogamy and immediately say, well, that's just cheating, but with better PR, So can you explain what differentiates CNM from infidelity? What are the key distinctions people need to know here?
Yeah, sure. So consensual non-monogamy is kind of this general term that we use to refer to any relationship where partners have agreed to either have sex, develop intimacy, form attachments with people other than just within a monogamous pair bond. And really what distinguishes that from really just having multiple partners in general is how people approach it. What are some of the agreements that people make? So the operative word there is consensual, right? Where you could be non-monogamous and you could be non-monogamous in a way where you are lying to your partner about the fact that you are non-monogamous, and that's connected to all sorts of troublesome relationship outcomes. Or you could talk it through with them such that they know what to expect from these other relationships that you're having. They feel a little bit safer about it, and therefore they can get to this point where they say, okay, I consent to that. I'm okay with that. And it's usually after they've had this time to discuss and take these precautions to prevent some of the things that you would maybe normally expect from having multiple partners, right? You have to share time. There might be some of those competitive feelings. There might be a little bit of, rivalry between partners. You're concerned about how you're spending time. So once you, I think, work that out, then people can consent to it. They can take those precautions and from those precautions feel much more safe about it compared to just something like infidelity where you're telling your partner, oh, I'm going to be monogamous to you. I'm not going to form these other relationships, but I'm going to do something anyway. And I'm not going to tell you about it. And just not telling them about it, that can introduce some difficulties.
Yeah, definitely. So by definition, CNM, consensual non-monogamy, isn't cheating, right? That's why the word consensual is in the name. And, a way that I often talk about this is that you've got consensual non-monogamy and you've got non-consensual non-monogamy. And the non-consensual non-monogamy is really where we're falling into the realm of cheating and infidelity. That's totally different from where things are on the up and everyone has agreed to everything that's going on. But here's another misconception about CNM. A lot of people assume that if you're in some kind of sexually open relationship, that cheating can't happen. There's sort of this assumption that it's a sexual free for all. And maybe for a few people, it is. But for most, that's not the reality. Cheating can still happen in a non monogamous context, but what it looks like might be very different compared to, say, a monogamous relationship. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what cheating might look like in the context of CNM, and in what ways is that similar to or different from cheating in a monogamous situation?
Yeah, so we actually have a little bit of data on this from the data set that we gathered, the international data set, where we asked people, well, how do you define infidelity? And we were able to differentiate between those who are monogamous and consensually non-monogamous. And what we're finding, so I'll start with what we found, and then maybe we can kind of build out from there. What we're finding is that monogamous people, because they're walking into their relationship with this template of what people are allowed to do within that relationship. You're not allowed to have sex. You're not allowed to fall in love, have attachment with other people. They all clearly agree. And what they nominate is usually very specific behaviors. They say, yeah, infidelity is having sex, or it's forming attachments. People in consensually non-monogamous relationships, well, clearly they allow that. That's okay. And so that's not infidelity. But what they tend to mention more often are things like, did you deceive me? Did you lie? Did you say you were going to do one thing and then did something else? Or did you break a relationship agreement that we had agreed to prior, right? So the infidelity seems to revolve more around the deception part of it, whereby I'm okay with you having sex, but maybe that sex needs to happen in a particular way, right? Maybe I want to make sure that you are following good, safer sex practices such that I'm not going to contract an STI, or you're not going to get someone else pregnant, or you're not going to get pregnant. And so what you're doing is you're making these agreements ahead of time about very particular types of behaviors that are meant to protect you and your partner. So if you break those agreements, then what you're doing is you're kind of introducing these harms that you have agreed to precaution against. And so that seems to be more what infidelity is for people who are consensually non-monogamous. Now, I think that opens up how infidelity is defined. And I think there are some differences there. But really, I think the element that's common to both of them is deception. It is lying. I think that if you really drill down into people who are in monogamous relationships and their agreements, you have sex, you fall in love with someone else, the thing that really hurts is the betrayal, right? It's the feeling that your partner has gone back on an agreement that you have. So I think that's actually the common element. It's just that people in consensually non-monogamous relationships might have had those discussions much more explicitly. And so they know precisely this, and this are infidelity, as opposed to just following that script of, oh, all sex, all emotion, right?
Yeah, I think you can look at this at a meta level or a micro level when we're talking about what cheating is. And I think, at the meta level, for people in monogamous or consensually non-monogamous relationships, it's the same thing. It's a broken agreement. You did something that you weren't supposed to do. And there probably was some element of deception, that you lied about it or you tried to get away with it without your partner finding out about this thing. But then at the micro level, cheating is going to look very, very different. And even within monogamous relationships, what constitutes cheating for one monogamous person might be very different for someone else. Some people might count kissing somebody else as cheating. Some people might count flirting with an AI chatbot to be cheating, right?
Or just watching pornography, something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, and something like 1 in 10 people count watching porn as a form of cheating. And some studies actually put the number even higher than that. So yeah, at that micro level, cheating just means totally different things to different people, whether it's monogamous or consensually non-monogamous. Now, a lot of the stigma that people attach to CNM seems to come from this misconception that CNM is just cheating, but with better branding. And so I have to ask, why do you think outsiders often assume that CNM always has like this dark underbelly to it, where they assume that there has to be some kind of secrecy or coercion or exploitation that's involved? What do you think it is that's really driving the negative views that so many people seem to hold about CNM?
Probably the big thing is a lack of imagination, right? You have this one template of how things happen, and if it deviates from that, then someone must be cheating, someone must be lying, someone must be trying to exploit someone else. But I actually do think it goes a little bit deeper than that. One of the ideas that I played with a little while ago, me and my co-authors, is that if you look at the kinds of personality traits, so developmentally, the kinds of traits that cluster together, if we look at what's called unrestricted sociosexuality, that is a greater interest and desire for more positive attitudes towards casual sex, having multiple partners, what you tend to see is that trait doesn't necessarily occur in isolation, that there are other personality traits that can tend to go along with interest in multiple partners. And one of the frameworks that we use to talk about this is what's called life history theory. Very briefly, the idea that there are multiple ways of reproducing and producing children and having those children propagate onto the next generation. Broadly speaking, you could talk about two strategies. One that's a slower life strategy where you tend to have, one or a few partners, a few children. You invest heavily into those children, and then you hope that from that intense investment, your children go on and they have their own lives and they flourish and all that. Alternatively, you could have something that's more of a fast life history. And this is what developmentally, people tend to get shunted into when they experience kind of more tumultuous, unpredictable, harsh environments early in life. And the idea here is, well, if you make an investment in just a few children or a few partners, that might not pay off in 10 years, right? Because your environment is so unstable, you won't know if that investment pays off. What you might want to do is hedge your bets a little bit, right? Have multiple partners, have multiple children, and maybe not invest as much in each of them. Now, broadly speaking, there are some issues with applying this framework to humans, and we can get into that, but it does help to explain a little bit about, I think, maybe why people stigmatize, in general, unrestricted sociosexuality, because what they might be doing is saying, oh, you have multiple partners? What other traits have I seen that typically go along with having multiple partners? Things like impulsivity or discounting the future, right? Not maybe planning so much into the future. Now, of course, this is not to say people who are polyamorous or people who are all, non-monogamous are necessarily doing these things. But on average, if you think about the kind of stereotypes people are going to form, chances are they're going to connect those dots and say, well, if you're having multiple partners, maybe you're also likely to have these other traits. And so you're right. You look at the literature. I mean, there's tons of research on stigma against consensual non-monogamy. People tend to perceive them as less educated. They dehumanize them more. They attribute fewer moral emotions to them. They think they are less capable of guilt and shame and things like that. They want to socially distance themselves from people who are non-monogamous. And so I think what they're doing is they're perceiving a threat, right? They're perceiving that if I interact with this person, they might be kind of in this developmental canal, this pathway that if I were to get involved with them, or if I were to kind of let them into my life, that might be a threat to my way of life. I think there's this perceived threat. But I think the problem is, again, this is where I say, I don't think the imagination's not good enough, is people do seem to be in these in consensually non-monogamous relationships doing something that is maybe being honest or recognizing that they either have these interests, have these traits, maybe they are on that developmental path, but at the same time, they're doing things to precaution against some of the harms you might expect from those individuals. So what I think is happening is people are, again, assuming traits from a very narrow window of information, just how many sexual partners you have, right? And from there, it's what do you do with those traits? How do you respond to that? Do you precaution against, for example, if you're more likely to get into competition with other people because you're competing for the same partners, what are you doing to prevent that potential rivalry? Or what are you doing to, say, soften the blow of that competition and how well people get along? That's kind of where I'm thinking in terms of stigmas. I think that it is this overreach of what people assume.
Here's something that's going to sound kind of wild. FirmTech has documented over 136,000 erections. Yes, really. And because of that, they've built an incredible database that's changing the game when it comes to improving erectile health. Here's the problem. ED is often handled by guesswork, but FirmTech's Tech Ring finally gives men and their doctors data. How hard you're getting, how long you're staying there, whether your meds are working, and whether pumps, PRP, or shockwave therapy will actually help you. It even helps optimize dosing for ED meds, and they have the science to back it up. But here's my favorite part. The Tech Ring isn't just measuring erections, it's improving them. FirmTech's rings keep more blood in the penis, giving you firmer erections, more confidence, and more intense orgasms. There are even studies showing that it performs as well as taking 10 milligrams of tadalafil for certain men. Pills help get blood into the penis, but rings help keep it there. Plus, FirmTech's massive database revealed something that no one expected. For most guys, the real issue behind fading erections isn't dysfunction, it's venous leak. You get hard, then lose it. But the Tech Ring can help pinpoint that early, even before you notice it yourself. It can also flag cardiovascular-based ED, the kind that really needs a doctor's attention. Bottom line, we're all on the road from erectile fitness to erectile dysfunction, but with FirmTech, we can actually stop or reverse course. Check the show notes for the link to learn more and save 15% off your first Firm Tech order. Stay fit, stay firm. Let's be honest, every family has that one person who is impossible to shop for during the holidays. You know exactly who I'm talking about. And every year, you spend way too much time stressing over what to get them. Well, this year, I have a simple solution: Cozy Earth. The best gift you can give is something that cuts through the holiday chaos and invites someone to slow down, de-stress, and actually enjoy being at home. And that's where Cozy Earth shines. Their products feel special the moment you touch them, and the quality actually lasts. When I gave my partner a bamboo sheet set from Cozy Earth, it became the gift he couldn't stop talking about. We use it every single day. Getting into bed now feels luxurious, and the breathable fabric made from viscose from bamboo keeps us the perfect temperature all night long. Our sleep has never been better. And the best part is how stress-free they make everything. You get a 100-night sleep trial to make sure you love it, and a 10-year warranty because they know these products are built to last. Right now, Black Friday has come early at Cozy Earth. Use code Justin for 40% off. These deals won't stick around, so start your holiday shopping early. And if you get a post-purchase survey, be sure to mention that you heard about Cozy Earth right here. Check the show notes for the link, and be sure to use code Justin to claim your discount. Wrap the ones you love in luxury with Cozy Earth. Yeah, that makes sense to me, that people might be applying some stereotypes here. And I think for some people, the only people they've ever known or seen in their life who have had multiple partners are people who might be engaged in infidelity, or people who might be going about this in a way that's not necessarily on the up and up. And so they assume that there are some of these other negative traits that are going along with that. But the CNM stigma is real. Terry Conley did a kind of landmark study on this where she asked people to evaluate the traits of individuals who were in monogamous or sexually open relationships. And she found that even on totally arbitrary traits, like how likely are you to take a daily multivitamin or floss your teeth every day, they rated people in consensually non-monogamous relationships as being lower on those things, right? Where there's just sort of this assumption that they're kind of like quote unquote bad people across the board. So there's something weird that's going on that's at the root of a lot of this stigma.
And that's been well replicated at this point, right? This isn't just Terry Connolly's work. Many people have again and again, this stereotype doesn't seem to be dying. And it's replicated even in more recent studies. So I think, society's attitudes towards these types of relationships is changing, but I think there's still that holdover. And I'm going to guess there's that holdover because people are always cautious about something that's potentially threatening to them.
Yeah, it's interesting how there's so much talk in the media about consensual non-monogamy and polyamory being on the rise, and how everybody's talking about it and Googling it, and you're seeing it depicted in the media. And there's sort of this moral panic that's kind of going on about it, where there's this assumption that everybody's going to start doing it. And, the reality is that overall attitudes are actually still pretty negative toward consensual non-monogamy. And so I don't think you're going to see this big seismic shift in the way that people are approaching relationships simply because monogamy is so embedded in our culture, and the attitudes toward anything other than monogamy largely are still really negative. And I think it is interesting to kind of explore, the roots of that. Where does this come from? And why is the bias against anything other than monogamy so strong? And I think, you can look at that through multiple lenses. There can be a religious lens that is applied to that. There can be these deeper things that are tied to our culture. There can be these individual patterns of what we've seen in our own lives. So it's a complex question in terms of where does that stigma come from in the first place? Now, one of the big myths about consensual non-monogamy is that jealousy doesn't exist in this world. And if it does, it either means that the relationship isn't working or that those people just weren't cut out for non-monogamy to begin with. But jealousy can and does show up in CNM relationships sometimes. So I was wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about that and how the emergence of jealousy in a non-monogamous context doesn't necessarily mean that the relationship is broken.
Yeah, so I think it's important to think about why we feel jealous in the first place, right? Well, jealousy really it's a warning system. You perceive that there's a threat to a relationship that you consider valuable, right? So you can be in a relationship. I think one of the reasons that people say, oh, if you don't feel jealousy, it's bad, is because if you're in a relationship and your partner is kind of flirting with someone, there's a threat that you perceive, and then you just don't care. What that might mean is you don't really value your partner. I think that's an assumption that people tend to make. And so jealousy is this kind of warning signal to say, my partner is spending time, spending resources, spending attention with someone else in a way that I think is going to affect the quality of our relationship together. And so I think more than just this negative experience that you want to avoid, I mean, I don't think this is just consensually non-monogamous people, but I think especially they have gotten wise to this, that I'm going to feel jealousy. It's going to be there. And when I feel it, I shouldn't get lost in that emotion. I should bookmark it and say, this is a signal that my brain is sending to me and saying, I might need to change something about my relationship. I might need to talk to my partner and address something with them. And so you approach your partner, and what people in consensual non-monogamous relationships are really good at is they know how to usually communicate about jealousy. And so if their partner comes to them and says, I'm feeling jealous, their reaction isn't, no, you have nothing to feel worried, you have nothing to worry about. There's nothing. There is someone else there. There might be something that you guys need to address, and maybe time resources aren't being spent in a way that's really equitable or, fair in some way. And so it's just this, okay, you're feeling jealousy. Why? What's underlying that? What perception of threat is underlying that feeling? And then can we do something to address that threat so that you do feel less jealous, right? So I think the solution is not so much, we don't feel jealousy anymore because we have multiple partners. It's almost seeing it as this diagnostic signal, right? Your check engine light.
Yeah, jealousy is information, is a good way to think about it. And the way that people handle jealousy in monogamous and consensually non-monogamous contexts is often very different. In a non-monogamous context, people are often going to discuss that and figure out a way to resolve those feelings. And it doesn't mean that the relationship is broken or that there's something wrong with the individuals involved. It's just kind of a natural response to those feelings of threat within a relationship. It's just a matter of how do you deal with those feelings.
And it might be a perception too. It doesn't even have to be real. You can feel jealousy,
absolutely.
And then you realize, oh, geez, I had no reason to feel jealous, or it was miscalibrated. I was just perceiving a threat that wasn't actually there.
Totally. Now, something I've talked about before on the show is that there's often a lot of politics involved when it comes to discussions about CNM. And obviously there's this one side that is very anti anything other than monogamy, and they will argue that open relationships just never work for anyone ever, period, right? So, you've got that one sort of extreme view, but then there's also this extreme view on the other side that's very pro non-monogamy, sometimes to the point of presenting overly rosy depictions of the community where they talk about it in a way that implies that everybody who's doing it is kind of like living in perfect harmony, that it's always 100% ethical, that there's no conflict, no jealousy. But the reality, as with anything else, always lies somewhere in between the extremes. Just like any other type of relationship, there are going to be challenges in a consensually non-monogamous one. The challenges just might look a little bit different. So besides jealousy, what are some of the real logistical or emotional challenges that can arise when you're seeing more than one other person, even when everybody is fully on board with this and communicating about it openly?
So I think it really depends on where you start. For example, if you're single and you don't already have pre-existing expectations about what your relationship's going to look like, then I think there's a little bit more flexibility there. But for example, I think one of the problems that you can face when you're currently in a relationship, you open up that relationship, is you may have been with that partner for a very long time. You have established patterns of spending time together, of dividing resources up, of et cetera, et cetera. And now someone else is in the picture. And you might have this drive to preserve what you have and yet also make space for this new person and for your partner to enjoy that relationship. And so I think that there is this great conflict for time and resources. Mm-hmm. There's this fear that, say, if your partner's with somebody else and they're really enjoying that time, you're also going to get these signals from them. You're going to perceive this way as, oh, this person doesn't want to spend time with me anymore. They're on their way out. They want to break up with me, right? If you were in a monogamous relationship and your partner was spending time with someone else, that is a reasonable conclusion, right? But if you're allowing it, you might still be having the response because you're used to that as your normal response to your partner hanging out with somebody else. But now you kind of have to reframe, think differently of, is this genuinely a threat that they're spending time with this other person? I also think one of the emotions that doesn't get enough airtime. I think we talk a lot about jealousy. I don't think we talk enough about envy. Mm-hmm. Your partner's with someone else. they're having a good time. They probably have new relationship energy. They're feeling that passion. They want to hang out with them all the time. And you can get in your head, well, what do they have that I don't, right? Why are you so excited to hang out with them, but not hang out with me in the same way? And so you start looking at them and you start thinking, geez, they've got something. They're taking my partner away from me. I wish I had what they had, right? There's some trait that they had that I'm not able to give them. And then that, I think, can lead to a lot of competition, rivalry, right? Where you see kind of this other person, not as a friend, not as another person, another human in the world who's just kind of enjoying a relationship and living life. But now they're this direct competitor. They're this person who's taking something away from you. I think envy is an underappreciated negative emotion in all that.
Are you looking to kickstart your intimate life or improve your sexual health and wellness? There are tons of supplements on the market that make bold promises. Unfortunately, however, finding one that actually lives up to the hype is a tall order because so many of the products out there contain questionable ingredients, are underdosed, or just don't work at all. That's why I'm excited to tell you about VB Health. VB Health is in the business of trust and transparency. Their sexual wellness supplements are doctor formulated and rigorously third-party tested for purity and potency. They're also made right here in the USA. Whether you're looking to boost your sex drive, support semen health, or increase vaginal lubrication, VB Health has something for you. If you're ready to ditch the shady stuff and choose a sexual health supplement that's effective and that you can feel confident about, it's time to check out VB Health's range of supplements, including Drive Boost, Load Boost, and Soaking Wet. Learn more and get yours at vb.health. Visit vb.health and use code Justin for 10% off, or click the link in the show notes. Yeah, definitely. Something else that's important here in terms of like some of the challenges is just the issue of time management when you have multiple partners. I'm remembering this was a decade or so ago. I was at a conference and one of my friends who was polyamorous was there, and we were supposed to meet in the bar to have drinks after we were all checked into the hotel. And he comes down very late because he had to call all of his partners to let them know that he got there. and I was already, like 2 cocktails in because, I just gave my partner a quick call and headed down to the bar. But he was somebody who had to talk to like all of his different partners. And it sounded kind of exhausting, right? Because there's a lot that needs to happen when you're coordinating multiple relationships. And so time management is an issue that people kind of have to figure out in terms of how do you balance all of those relationships. And it takes time to have more than one. And something else that adds a wrinkle to that is that we know from research that people with ADHD are actually more open to the idea or more interested in consensual non-monogamy. And you know what people with ADHD's biggest challenge is? Well, it's time management, right? So, even though people with ADHD might be more inclined or predisposed to these types of relationships, they are also in a position where it can be uniquely hard for them to manage and juggle having multiple partnerships all at once. And so whether you have ADHD or not, like that time management piece is a big issue here.
Yeah. I like the idea of, love is kind of infinite. You can spread love around, but, like time and attention and resources and how you're actually spending time with someone, that is it's not infinite, right? There's only so much time in the day. Besides time management, I think there needs to be this recognition that at a certain point, you might not be able to manage as many relationships as you're trying to have. And so you may not be you might not have whatever resources, whether it's skill, whether it's literally like money to be spending on partners and buying them gifts and all that. There might be this upper limit of how much you can really do. And I imagine, say, someone who's not very good at managing their time would fall into that trap more easily.
Yeah. I mean, you've got limits, like a finite amount of time that you can devote to your relationships, and you have finite emotional bandwidth, right? And so there is a limit at some point, and that's why the term polysaturation exists, when people sort of reach that limit. But the problem, unfortunately, is that a lot of people don't know what their limit is until they've exceeded it. And so where I've seen things go wrong for some people who are polyamorous is that they take on too many relationships too quickly, and then all of a sudden they are exhausted because they don't know how to manage and navigate all of that at once, because maybe they've bit off a little bit more than they can chew there.
Mm-hmm. And then that accidentally feels like infidelity because your partner is then not doing the things that they agreed, spending time in a certain way or managing right?
Yeah. Now, another part of the stigma against CNM is that many people equate it with irresponsible and unsafe sexual behavior. There's sort of this assumption that non monogamous relationships are inherently a hotbed for STIs, that everybody's going to have everything all the time. Now, what's the truth here? And what does the data show around things like safer sex practices for people in CNM versus monogamous relationships?
So it is complicated because if you really dive into all the studies that exist, some studies will show, yes, there's a great risk. Some people, say there's no greater risk, or in fact, they're doing a better job than people who are monogamous, et cetera, et cetera. I'll start with some of the data that we collected. We actually collected information about how often people get tested. And so we have information about monogamous people. We also have information about swingers and people in open relationships and people who are polyamorous. There are different types of consensual non-monogamy. And what we found is that, in particular, people who are polyamorous, they reported within our sample being 3 times as likely to get tested for an STI, but they were no more likely to have tested positive for an STI. So what they're doing is they're taking these precautions. They're going and getting tested more often, but then presumably as a result of that, what they're doing is they're protecting their network, right? They're making sure that STIs aren't within the network and then potentially be spread. What we do know about people with multiple partners is that if you have a network and you have multiple partners within that network, and there are no precautions taken whatsoever, people's risk of contracting an STI is higher, right? That's biology. That's just the mechanics of how pathogens spread. You have more contact between people, there's a greater chance for that stuff to spread. So the best predictors of STI spreading are network connectivity. That is how many nodes within a network, how many individuals within a network are actually interacting with one another and potentially spreading something. However, if you're doing what, for example, people who are polyamorous are doing, and they're getting tested regularly, and you are protecting the network, then the connectivity won't matter anymore because the STIs aren't even in the network in the first place. So, yes, having more sexual partners just in and of itself is a predictor of having more STIs within your lifetime. However, within consensual non-monogamy, they are layering this extra practice on top to prevent the STIs from even being in the network or spreading in the first place. Now, of course, like I said, that's not true of everyone. Within our sample, the polyamorous people were doing that very well. But people who were swingers, people who were in open relationships, they were not doing that any more than, say, people who are monogamous. And if you look at some other samples of swingers in particular, sometimes some swinger groups are not taking those precautions as thoroughly as other relationships. So there is some diversity there. So I would say anyone who is consensually non-monogamous or wants to be consensually non-monogamous, I think one of the things that I hear often is, oh yeah, everyone handles their sexual health so well. And I think that is a presumption, right? You have to, if you get involved with someone or several others, you really should be, I think, making sure that they are engaging in these preventative practices, that they are taking precaution. And then once you can be sure that they're doing that responsibly, then you can have a little bit more trust, a little bit more. But I don't think that it's a good idea to just go into the dynamic assuming that people are being safe, because groups do vary.
Yeah, I think that's an important point. And, I actually published a paper, I want to say it was probably around 2015 in the Journal of Sexual Medicine, where I looked at rates of STIs for people in open versus monogamous relationships and actually found that there was no difference on average in terms of rates of having previously had an STI. And a lot of people found that to be surprising because they're like, well, people with more partners necessarily should have more STIs, but no, there's actually a really big difference in safer sex practices and STI testing. And also when you account for the fact that in monogamous relationships, infidelity is common, 20 to 25% of married partners will cheat on each other at some point. And actually, it turns out that when people commit infidelity in a monogamous context, they usually don't take precautions. It's more likely than not that they're not going to use a condom. And so then that creates this opportunity for STIs to spread even within a monogamous relationship. So, even though on average, I didn't find a difference between these two groups, I think you're so right that within the consensual non-monogamous world, there are lots of different subgroups, and some might have higher risk than others based on the networks that they're in and what their sexual health practices are. If you're thinking about a polyamorous closed loop or triad, for example, where you have three people and they're only interacting sexually with one another, well, there's not necessarily going to be an elevated risk of STIs in that case. But if you're talking about something that's an open network, that's a totally different situation. So people often like to speak about CNM or consensual non-monogamy as this monolith when it comes to sexual health, but you're right that it absolutely isn't the case. So thank you so much for this amazing conversation, Justin. I'm really looking forward to diving further into the topic of CNM with you in the next episode, where we're going to talk about what makes CNM relationships actually work. Can you please tell my listeners where they can go to learn more about you and your work and read your new paper all about multiple relationships?
I have several different social media accounts. Just Google me, you'll find something. But what I'm doing is I am trying to take this paper, which is published in Archives of Sexual Behavior. Well, it's in press. It's coming out soon. But if you go to my Substack, what I'm doing there is I'm trying to take what we've written in this paper and translate it for a more popular audience. And so I am in the process of kind of writing that. So if you want to get in that slipstream, that's great. Otherwise, you'll find me on Facebook, X, Blue Sky, find your flavor. I'll be there. But if you're really nerdy and you want to read all my papers, ResearchGate is where I upload everything. It's freely available.
Well, great. And I'll be sure to include links to all of that in the show notes. So thank you again so much for your time. I really appreciate having you here.
Thanks, Justin.
Thank you for listening. To keep up with new episodes of this podcast, visit my website, Sex and Psychology, at sexandpsychology.com, or subscribe on your favorite platform, where I hope you'll take a moment to rate and review the show. If you listen on Apple Podcasts, please consider becoming a Sex and Psychology premium subscriber to enjoy ad-free listening for just $3.99 a month. You can also follow me on social media for daily sex research updates. I'm on Blue Sky and X at Justin Lehmiller and Instagram at Justin J. Lehmiller. Also, be sure to check out my book, Tell Me What You Want. Thanks again for listening. Until next time.